To talk about with Trump's convention manager, Paul Manafort. Paul, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it.
Good to see you.
I want to start with this meeting that Donald Trump had with House Speaker Paul Ryan on Thursday.
Right.
People in the Ryan world describe it as a meeting where Donald Trump said what they wanted to hear, what Speaker Ryan wanted to hear about how he would comport himself going forward, and Ryan's concerns about things that Trump has said that potentially alienated women, Latinos, et cetera. But in the New York Times this morning, Mr. Trump told Maureen Dowd, quote, "We talked about the success I've had," Trump replied. So Ryan didn't ask Trump to stop making remarks that alienate women? No, Trump said. He wants me to be me. So much, Maureen Dowd writes, for the showdown. So which is it? Did he affirm to Paul Ryan, Speaker Ryan, that he was going to behave in a quote-unquote more presidential manner? Or was the conclusion he's got to be him?
Look, both statements have elements of, or both true, actually. I mean, Donald Trump was not asked by the leadership to change, and there's no reason for him to change. He's just won the primary process with a record number of votes, beating a field of 16 qualified candidates. So there's no reason for Donald Trump to change.
Well, that's not necessarily true, though. I mean, appealing to one party's electorate, whether it's Democrat or Republican, is not appealing to a general election electorate.
That's correct, but Trump in the primaries was appealing to the broader electorate, which is why you had crossover Democrats, independents participating in the Republican primaries where they could, even though there were spirited contests going on in the Democratic side. Now, that's not to say that Paul Ryan didn't talk about policy. They actually got along very well. The conversations that they had focused on the Trump agenda for America, to make America great again, and Paul Ryan's agenda to return prosperity. There were a lot of overlap on the objectives of both of those programs.
But surely you look at the negative ratings that Mr. Trump has with women at large in the general electorate and Latinos, and you think, going forward, it's going to be tough to win the White House if those negatives stay where they are.
Well, you know, this is one of these conventional wisdom facts that are not correct. Yes, there's some high negatives on the part of Trump right now, who's just come out of a very spirited contest. Hillary Clinton's got high negatives too. And when you look at the recent Quinnipiac polls that came out last week, which show Trump winning in Florida and even or slightly ahead in Ohio and Pennsylvania, you look at the gender gaps, and the real gender gap is a male gender gap on the part of Clinton, where she's got a bigger disparity between her support with men than Trump has with women. So it's an issue. It'll be dealt with. We're coming through a healing process. This is when we're unifying our party. The national polls have all shown closure, where Trump now is either 1 or 2 points behind or 1 or 2 points ahead. Mm-hmm. So this is way early, and still already we're seeing convergence on the part of the electorate with Donald Trump. And the meetings with the Hill, with the leadership, were very positive.
Let's talk about the policy of nominees, or tradition, rather, of nominees releasing their tax returns. It's been a tradition since 1976. It's done to show the American people if there are any conflicts of interest, to show how much charity has been given by the nominee, and to see how much the nominee is actually paying in taxes. Now, Mr. Trump had said in the past that he would release his returns if he became the nominee. Now he says voters do not necessarily have a right to see them. Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bob Dole, George W. Bush, John McCain, Mitt Romney, all of those nominees thought that voters had a right to see them. Why does Mr. Trump feel differently?
He doesn't feel differently. He has said he will release his tax returns, never has changed his position. What he has said is he's under audit now, and once the audit is completed, he will release the tax.
Well, why not release the ones from before the audit? Why not release, if 2015, first of all, the IRS says you can release them to the public even if they're under audit. But why not release 2014, 2013, 2012 and just put this issue to rest?
Well, as I understand it, the audit is going on for the last 8 years. They're going back 8 years worth of tax returns. And anything beyond 8 years is not going to be reflective of anything other than interest on the part of the media.
But you know, Nixon released his returns while under audit, and Donald Trump released his returns to a gaming commission, I believe, while under audit when he was trying to get a casino in New Jersey.
This is an issue that the media is interested in. It's not an issue that middle America is interested in, frankly. Donald Trump has been very clear. He will release it. He will comply when the audit is done. You talk to tax attorneys who are not politically motivated, and they'll tell you they would never advise their client to release any tax information in the course of an audit.
So you're saying that the audit is for 8 years worth of returns?
That's what I'm led to believe, yes.
I still don't understand why, just to get this out of the way, Mr. Trump wouldn't just release the returns. I mean,
because they're not complete yet.
Is there something in there that Mr. Trump doesn't want the American people to see, and for that reason, you've made the calculation better to take the hit because the American people really aren't that engaged in it as opposed to the media, and than to take the hit on what is in the returns?
He said there's nothing in there. I have no basis to believe otherwise.
Let me ask you about this other question. The Washington Post on Friday reported that Donald Trump used to pass himself off as his own public relations agent, either named John Barron or John Miller. I want you to listen to this 1991 recording of a People magazine reporter speaking with someone who claims to be, quote unquote, John Miller.
He really decided that he wasn't, he didn't want to make the commitment. He didn't want to make a commitment. He really thought it was too soon. He's coming out of a marriage that, and he's starting to do tremendously well financially. He's got an all open field, really. And a lot of the people that you write about, and you people do a great job, by the way, actresses, people that you write about just call to see if they can go out with them and things.
Now, are you seriously, is the campaign seriously claiming that that isn't Mr. Trump?
I could barely understand it. I couldn't tell who it is. Donald Trump says it's not him. I believe it's not him.
In 1990, under oath, he testified that he did use the name John Barron, and in 1991, he told People magazine that he did use the name John Miller. So this has already been admitted previously. I don't understand why now.
I don't know those facts to be true or not. I just know that he said it's not him. I believe him. I don't even know the relevance of this, frankly. It's other than it's 25 years old. It's dealing with interests that People magazine oriented, and they're not focusing on the issues that Trump is trying to talk about today, which are jobs, terrorism, immigration problems. I mean, these are the issues we should be talking about. Why the media is spending so much time going back 25 years old to talk about a People magazine tape that may or may not be Trump. Well, it's totally irrelevant.
First of all, Mr. Trump has brought up things that were 25 years old on behalf of Mr. Clinton, former President Clinton. But second of all, I think the issue is
that was not People magazine. Those were issues that related to a core component of Hillary Clinton's strategy, which is that she's talking about breaking the ceiling for women, and yet she was an enabler and made the victims of those dalliances into a real bad situation.
My point is just that whether or not it took place in the 90s doesn't seem to be an issue, but the larger issue, and I understand your point about jobs and trade and terrorism, issues that we talk about on CNN all the time, that I've talked to Mr. Trump about quite often. The issue is, I think, here you have a man in his 40s allegedly acting as his own public relations agent, bragging about his exploits with women while married to Ivana Trump, the mother of his 3 children, and it speaks to a certain kind of character issue, don't you think?
Well, but the tape has not proven that it's him. The justification for the tape is, well, words that are on that tape are words Donald Trump uses. I've been working for Donald Trump for 6 weeks. I'm using words he uses. Now, I'm not the person on that tape. There's no basis in fact other than some allegation, and now they're even saying that he leaked the tape, that he had his tape for 25 years, and he leaked the tape. It makes no sense.
Well, when you start saying, the construct I think you're looking for is tremendously successful. That's the one that he uses a lot in real life and that John Miller used in there. But let me move on, because there's an issue having to do with you that I want to give you the opportunity to address, which is there's this 1992 report from the Center for Public Integrity, which listed your firm as one of the lobbying firms that profited most by doing business with foreign countries in which there were human rights issues with how those governments treated their people. You were reportedly the closest political advisor, American political advisor, to Viktor Yanukovych of Ukraine, who's a close ally of Vladimir Putin. And now there are people in the national security apparatus who are saying that they have questions about Donald Trump now getting classified briefings because of you, because of your close ties to Viktor Yanukovych and others. How do you respond to that?
Well, there are so many different parts of that we said are wrong. First of all, I don't see the classified briefings. Donald Trump sees the classified briefings.
You're not in the room when he receives them?
Not in the room when he receives them. He doesn't talk to me about them. So there's a total barrier there. Secondly, I have no foreign clients now. I have no clients. I have one client, Donald Trump.
Right, but you have in the last decade.
Third, some of those clients that you're talking about, if you go back and look, they were in concert with U.S. foreign policy. As far as the Yanukovych administration is concerned, you will see, if you do any fact-checking, that I was the person that negotiated the framework, which is based upon which Ukraine is now a part of Europe. That was my role. That's what I did. And when it was completed, I left.
I did do a lot of fact-checking, and Reuters wrote a very extensive story that talked about you being a strong political advisor to Viktor Yanukovych. Not just you, other American consultants, including Tad Devine at the Sanders campaign, but you being a very powerful and influential person with Viktor Yanukovych.
And I was involved in activities that related to directly impacting positive U.S. and European foreign policy and that's what the facts will show.
Last question I want to ask you. Mr. Trump has talked a lot about remaking the map in his fight against Hillary Clinton. What are some states that are not traditional Democratic states in general elections that you think you can win, that Mr. Trump can make competitive in November?
You mean not traditional Republican states?
Yes, please.
Well, there are a number of them. There's Michigan, there's Pennsylvania, there are several New England states. We think that
New Hampshire, Maine?
New Hampshire for sure. Maine, a real possibility. Connecticut's a possibility.
Connecticut.
Yes, Connecticut. We are going to have, we're in the process now of organizing the framework for the strategy of our general election campaign. But without a doubt, when you look at the appeal of Donald Trump in the primaries that have been held so far, you see incredible crossover support. You see Democrat support for Bernie Sanders that is a potential Trump support, it's indicating that they will never vote for Hillary Clinton. And when you analyze who those people are that are saying it, they're the very demographic that Trump is appealing to in independents and crossover Democrats. So we think in a number of places for a lot of issues, jobs, integrity, coal, for example, in Pennsylvania and Ohio and elsewhere, we think there are a number of issues that allow us to expand the map. We think the Democrats are the ones who are going to have a very narrow way to victory, and we think we're going to be successful.
Paul Manafort, congratulations on Mr. Trump becoming the presumptive nominee. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you out there on the campaign trail.
You will.
Thanks for taking our questions today.